Hello and welcome to the podcast hosted by Alterbridge. Miss Clara Iglesias Keller, researcher at the Politics of Digitalization Group of the WZB Berlin Social Science Center and associated with the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. Clara is a doctor in public law and she has experience as a researcher, lecturer and a researcher in information technology regulation, having worked for the Brazilian Regulatory Agency for the audiovisual market. Ms. Iglesias Keller, first of all, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us today on a very interesting topic. And I hope it will be a very sort of interesting discussion between us. And thank you again for taking time during this global pandemic to speak to us and to Alterbridge. So first of all, I would like to sort of for you to just summarize what kind of research are you pursuing at the moment, and sort of what are your day-to-day activities as in all the fields that you are pursuing at the moment.
Thank you so much, Nina, for having me. I am super happy, super honored to be here to talk to you about my work. So as you mentioned, I'm a legal scholar, actually. I graduated in law. I'm a Bachelor of Law. I have 2 masters in law, and I'm a doctor in public law. So that's pretty much the perspective that I've been speaking from. And I'm also originally from Brazil. I've been living here in Berlin for 2.5 years now. And since I graduated law school, I've been very focused in media and communications regulations, right? And from 2011, I kind of focused my research on digitalization and regulatory issues, democratic tensions, and other sorts of free speech related conflicts that we see in cyberspace, what was once called cyberspace. So I've been looking at more specifically at that since 2011. And nowadays I have been very focused on digital platforms, but as this is a very broad term, what I'm mostly interested in is like content platforms, right? So social network, even messaging apps. I have a lot of research on disinformation, which is a topic that I've been mostly dedicated in the past 2 years. And in my doctor thesis, I have looked specifically at, from a very theory of regulation approach, I have looked at how governments should address services that are provided through the internet infrastructure.
Right.
So throughout all I'm looking at, I always have a perspective very focused on democratic legitimacy, on how to make sure that this regulation and that these services work in a legitimate way. And I'm also very fond of researching regulatory strategies,
right?
As in what would work better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Obviously, the topics that you named are very sort of trending internationally and in Georgia as well. Because one of the biggest criticisms of social media platforms is their lack of legitimacy, obviously, and we see this all the time. And this has been a subject of discussion in the presidential campaign run for the US president quite recently as well, when both candidates have been speaking about stripping the social media of the 230 protection of the Decency Act. Therefore, it is all very topical. And from reading your papers, you talk a lot about legitimacy of social media platforms. What do you see as a source of legitimacy for these platforms? And is adoption of a set of digital human rights for platforms, as well as enhanced transparency in decision-making process, an answer that digital society is looking for?
Yeah. So there's a reason why not only me, but most of us who work with these themes, we worry so much about legitimacy, right? It's because these services, they are intermediaries. They are positioned in a strategic way where they have a lot of control over content, a lot of control over what we can and what we cannot do online. And they also are very present, So what we have, as we have these private companies making decisions that influence what billions of people can do or say what they can access or what is the priority according to what they will actually access. So this is a lot of power, right? And this sort of like very great power is perhaps not comparable, but originally what we have seen in democratic states, right? In the way that democratic states are organized. So why are we worried about legitimacy? Because usually the institutions that make these choices for everyone are democratically elected institutions, right?
Right.
In, of course, democratic frameworks. Some countries do not necessarily adopt a democratic framework, but where this framework is adopted, those are the institutions responsible for doing that. And how are these institutions legitimized? So traditionally, theory of law and of political theory have that democratic government legitimacy comes from different things, mostly from public participation, voting. Other authors will tell you that it's about moral constriction, that legitimacy is when a person feels that that is the right rule that they should abide by. And other authors will say it's about process. It's like this law was made according to certain rules, right? Following a certain procedure. And that procedure, democratic procedure, is what makes it legitimate. So how do we transfer that to cyberspace, right? To platforms, to digital platforms? There are already as well efforts to imprint legitimacy outside of the state. So you see that in international law, you see that in theaters of global administrative law, you see that in other spaces as well. And even though legitimacy in these places is imprinted through other ways, it's very much is about the same ideas of allowing participation in different through different means. It's also about moral constriction, following procedures. So I believe that we also find these themes in the theories of how to make digital platforms legitimate. So some authors will say that it's about allowing the users to also have a choice, to have a call and participate on the way these rules are made. Other authors are going to say that it's about following a procedure that these platforms have to follow transparency, that they have to follow due process when handling content. Other authors are going to say that they have to respect human rights. And what I have recently written about with the political science professor from Canada called Blaine Haggards, we wrote a paper that we presented this month at the IGF. And my most recent take on this is that for this kind of service, when you look at through only one of these lenses, when you say that legitimacy is only one of these things, you tend to let other things pass, because at the end of the day, you cannot compare to the democratic state, right? Because the democratic state is elected. And that's like the biggest source of legitimacy. And you will never find that outside of the state. So we already have to adapt. We already have to think about something different. And my current take on this is in order to do that, you can't look just at one thing. You can look just at transparency rules. You can't look only at participation. You can't look only at human rights, because human rights are also a debatable concept, right? They can mean different things in different places. And every time you base a decision on that, it will be immediately questionable. So what we do propose is that we access this legitimacy from a broader framework, right? To look at different aspects. And I'm not going to talk about the whole paper here, but what we're going to say is that you mostly have, what we actually do, we chose a theory from an European author called Vivian Schmidt, and Vivian Schmidt herself also builds on the theory of Frank Schaff. And what they say is that, what she says is that legitimacy has to be looked at through 3 points of view: through input, which is participation; through output, which is result; and through throughput, which is the procedure through which the policy is made. Right. So that's mostly what I'm thinking about right now, that this assessment of legitimacy has to take into consideration several different aspects. And I think that speaks very well to the concept of governance that, has come to be the standard for analyzing online governance and online regulation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you are absolutely right in saying that There is no sort of consensus as such on the human rights across the world. I mean, different courts give different sort of interpretation to different human rights, and different human rights carry different types of weight in different jurisdictions. So to speak, it's really difficult to reach a sort of international framework that would work for everyone, that would fit all cultures, and that would just be, you know, acceptable to every authentic society in the world. So it's really interesting, your theory about legitimacy and how you've broken it down into sort of different types. So that's great, and thank you very much for that. And so moving on to my next question. In your recent paper, you have discussed UK online harms white paper, and you have come to the conclusion that even though far from perfect, it still stands deeply grounded in legitimacy. Could you please explain on what reasoning this is based, given the fact that UK online harms paper proposes to confer extended power to the regulator, which means that some rather important decisions will be made in the shadow of politics? Now, that's really interesting.
So what we mean by that, what me and Blaine meant by that, is that when these agents, the regulatory agencies, they're in the shadow of politics in the sense that they are not elected bodies, right? They are not the Congress, the Parliament. But at the same time, regulatory agencies, they are within a certain institutional design that in democratic countries is legitimized by this democratic design. So they are within separation of powers, they are subject to accountability, they are supposed to be transparent, they're supposed to be to follow due process. So in this sense, even though of course we all know better than to presume that all governmental decisions are going to be right about social media, right? We already know that's not true. But when we analyze the UK online harms paper through the legitimacy lenses that I briefly spoke about, we realized that this arrangement, this proposal had a good potential for democratic legitimacy, mostly because it is responsive to input, because even though they're not elected, they are within the democratic state, this democratic design. It is also strong in throughput, because regulatory agencies will observe due process, transparency, and these aspects that I just spoke about. And in terms of output, this is the one thing that we could not assess properly yet, because it's a policy still very much in the making. So that's kind of perhaps a weaker or still to be seen claim. So that's what we mean when we say that this is the one that is much rooted in still in democratic legitimacy. We analyzed other proposals in this paper as well, outside of the state. This is the one that was inside of the state that we chose to analyze. And of course that, in fact, it's a legitimate governance of online platforms from such a regulator would depend on how this regulator works, right? On how transparent their processes are, on how participative these processes are, on the actual expertise of the people that are appointed to lead these bodies. So it doesn't mean that any regulatory authority would be legitimacy and perfect to do that, but a regulatory authority that abides by this criteria of participation, transparency, and legitimacy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you've sort of preemptively spoken about what I was going to say, that it all depends on how the regulator works and what is the context, the local context in terms of the index for democracy, really, because it could be used both ways. So I guess when it comes to the UK, you know, being one of the leading democratic states of the world, there is more guarantee that it will be transparent. It won't be sort of you know, totalitarian in its nature, and it is the best sort of solution to the problem according to the infrastructure of social media, which is quite unique, and you know, the world needs to adapt. So I guess you're absolutely right in saying that it all depends on local context and how the regulator works in sort of individual states. So moving on to your next question. The Brazilian Senate has recently approved a bill that intends to harden the fight against the spread of fake news. Do you see any challenges associated with this bill? And you know, given the fact that it's been subject to wide criticism in Brazil.
Yeah, I see a few issues regarding the approval of this bill in Senate. So just to make it clear, this bill started today. This is actually a version that encompasses different bills that have already been presented in this year only. Like, it's been a super intense debate in Congress. At some point around May, congressmen would say that this had to be approved in a month or something. So everybody that researches this, social society, civil society, actually, sorry, everybody was super engaged in debating and scrutinizing the project. It was born as a disinformation targeting bill, right? So it defined the concept of disinformation. It was focused on content as well. And this was very problematic, right? Because when we're talking about the scope of freedom of expression, to have a law define what can and cannot be said, what is or is not disinformation, seemed very dangerous. So there's been a lot of debate. This bill has been transformed in many ways. And nowadays, even though it still carries the goal of fighting disinformation in its name or in its reasoning, in its rationales, this is in fact a bill that regulates digital platforms. It's not only about disinformation anymore. It's clearly a framework that has been inspired by the German NetzDG, by recent European discussions. And the thing, and what I see as a problem with this law is that it brings several different sorts of regulatory strategies that are different among each other, and that are extremely complex, and some of them are even problematic, in my opinion. So it's a very audacious project, which in my opinion is not immediately a problem, but it is a problem if you want to discuss it on a hurry, and if there's no time to actually measure the impact that these strategies will have on the actual digital market. So for instance, there are of course transparency provisions, which I find welcome. There are due process provisions for content moderation. At the same time, content moderation is treated as this general block, when in fact we know it's much more complex than that. That it encompasses different sorts and different degrees of online harms. You have since copyright infringement to child abuse images. So I personally believe it's dangerous to treat all this sort of content as one thing. It also, some of its versions also brought provisions about storage of metadata on messaging apps, which is very dangerous in terms of potential for surveillance. The biggest reason behind provisions as such was to allow that messages that are spread as a disinformation, with disinformation goals, can be traced to the people who actually to the people that actually produced and started spreading these messages. But this in fact just established would establish a big surveillance structure that would not necessarily be effective. So this is just to give you an overview of how various are these mechanisms that are being discussed in the same bill of law. So I think the biggest problem we have right now are a few specific provisions. They also propose a regulatory institutional arrangement with a transparency council and a possible self-regulatory body, which in my opinion also is not designed in a very productive and proper way. So if you know what I mean, there are a lot of complex regulatory strategies that need further examining, that need further polishing before they are actually turned into law. So this is my take. I really welcome regulatory initiatives that want to look at this market, understand it, and trying to find ways to stir it in the direction of the public interest. But I do worry about doing this in a hush, and I do worry about doing this based on mechanisms that have already proven to be ineffective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've been reading a lot about how many countries have followed the steps of Germany in terms of devising legislation similar to the Network Enforcement Act, NETDZ. But often those countries have sort of, as you correctly have said, they haven't really taken time to go through the whole process. It all seems to be rushed, and they seem to adopt one legislation that deals with a range of issues that shouldn't really be dealt in one legislation. So that is a real problem. But the trend seems to be towards the fact that, I mean, no one can really deny that more and more countries are talking about regulation because of the problems that have been thrown up by social media. But then again, we often see the debate between when you say word regulation, you don't want to be associated with word censorship. So we often see the debate between sort of freedom of expression and other rights. So it's an ongoing thing.
Yeah, if I may, like I
Yeah,
also have the impression that the NetzDG gets a hard time. Like it is a law that it also has its problems. It has been criticized. Since it was being drafted, it was criticized here in Germany. I do appreciate its effort, but also this thing with other countries copying the logics of the NetzDG and applying different ways. The NetzDG here in Germany has a very restricted scope. So it is only applicable to 22 conducts that are already provided by the German criminal code. So it's very specific, a very restricted scope. And yet, at least in Brazil, this inspiration is like being applied in a completely different context, in a completely different scope. So also think it's a matter of importing it without looking at it properly, and its scope and the different aspects, and even the reasons why it has been criticized. It's been implemented for like 2 years now or 3, and there's already some assessment on how it works. And yet this assessment is not considered, at least in Brazil. Some parts of the law that have already proven to not have been so good were copied. And it's like, okay, so let's just update this analysis. There's already results on this. Yeah. So we might as well use these results and use this analysis to build something better and more appropriate to the context that we're talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I understand. And I see a lot of challenges in sort of depending on a state. I mean, the challenges that Brazil has experienced in just sort of applying without any critical assessment of the results. This could be a case in many countries that I can think of. So it's really important to realize that, the German legislation, as you correctly said, is quite narrow, and it already sort of comprehensively condenses the liability that's reflected in other sorts of legislations. It's not a new sort of device for controlling social media. And even having said that, we often see examples of over sort of platforms being overly careful. I think that's one of the criticisms of the Act, that platforms delete content by sort of just being careful because they don't want to be subject to the liability under the legislation. So that's also something to think about, definitely. So moving on to the next question, just 1 second. Brazil has been sort of in the active center of discussion regarding fake news, unfortunately. And general elections in Brazil in 2018 have been sort of famously plagued with fake news. And you have actually spoken about this with your fellow researcher, Amelie at HIIG, which has been also very interesting for me to listen to. And fake news was disseminated in the bubble of so-called artificial echo created by advanced technology. In recent US presidential elections, social media platforms, namely Facebook and Twitter, have taken measures to ensure limitation of vicious circulation of fake news before results were formally announced. However, when we speak about some kind of control on fake news, we're also aware that freedom of expression stands on the other side of the debate. How do you think democratic societies should deal with fake news? I realize that's a difficult and a very broad question.
Yeah, this information is a multidimensional phenomenon, right? So it's not only about the law, it's not only about social sciences, it's not only about psychology, it's about many different things, you know, and you have a lot of research from different fields looking at this from different angles. And the very minimum thing that this can tell us about the answer is that it's not going to be just one answer, right? So it's certainly an effort for lots of different players in lots of different aspects. So what I mean is that there will be a role for civil society, there will be a role for journalism, there will be a role for fact checkers. And I believe there will also be a role for government. But what should this role be? Because we are talking about freedom of expression, and we don't want this rights to be suppressed. We do not want the government not. So I've been mapping out what governments have been doing. Are you still there, Nina?
Yes,
Do you still listen to
I
me?
can completely hear you. It's just the screen has been frozen. I hope it comes back. It came back. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've been mapping what is it that governments can do.
Yep.
And I've divided it in 3 groups. Okay, just for the sake of my own organization. So governments can criminalize speech and criminalize conducts towards disinformation.
Yeah.
Like it is a crime to spread, it is a crime to lie. Governments can regulate data because major disinformation strategies are mostly based on the illegal or inappropriate, at the very least, use of personal data. And governments can regulate structure, right? And what I mean by regulating structure is regulate companies, intermediaries, say that intermediaries can or cannot do this and that. They have to be transparent, they have to do this. And this is usually not a matter just regarding disinformation, right? It's also some sort of regulation that applies to hate speech and other of online harms. So I think what I do believe is that the first sort of strategy that I spoke about has exhaustively proved to be ineffective, and also a means to impose a certain take, a certain ideology. You know, when you say that a person can be arrested for spreading disinformation, this is one very focused action on one person that is unlikely to have a bigger effect on the structure that is producing and disseminating this information, and that is also likely to generate a chilling effect, right? If people start to think they can be arrested for what they say, for what they spread, this is certainly affect their exercise of free expression. So what I do believe is that the way for governments to go, remembering that along with all the other players that should be doing something about this. So what I tend to think is that governments should stay away from regulating the freedom of expression and focus on data regulation and focus on regulating platforms. That's my current take on it, but I might change my mind tomorrow.
No, fair enough. Thank you very much for sort of tackling this big question. As you correctly said, it is a big issue, and it all depends on really. You don't want to be seen as being sort of, as I said, opposed to democratic values. So it's a really, really careful debate. But then again, it's not just disinformation anymore. I mean, in our country, it's quite a lot of hate speech. And hate speech is not also something that's set in stone. For different countries. Different things may mean hate speech. It might be more offensive to be called, you know, a fascist in Germany than elsewhere. So it's really difficult sort of balance to strike. But we see a lot of it going on in on social media, because that's where people have voice and they can just openly launch attack on each other and on institutions as well. And there is no legal recourse as such. It's really difficult, other than sort of reporting mechanism and sort of just reporting back to social media or fact checking again through social media. It's really difficult to not to be defamed on social media. If someone wants to defame you, it's highly likely that they can do so. So it's important to start thinking about this. And moving on to my final question, you have mentioned that countermeasures that any countermeasures to fake news need to be of multidisciplinary character and involve stakeholders from different fields and not just lawyers. Also, it has been submitted that legal framework, if any, needs to first originate at a sovereign state level before some sort of framework is agreed at transnational level. In your opinion, what are the challenges that less democratic or young democratic states should be thinking about when considering putting in place countermeasures, and where do stakeholders from various fields derive their legitimacy from?
Well, I think that what I said before about regulatory strategies should be a greater concern for young democracies, in the sense that staying away from having a governmental authority saying what should or should not be said. Okay, so it is very important to have a solid data protection framework. This is something to be worked on. It is important to have an approach to intermediaries that also will not generate incentives for these intermediaries to censor people. And I believe that outside government and talking about these other multi-stakeholders, I think this is where the free speech and the fact checking and the different versions of information, this is where this should all be rolling, you know, outside of government. This is my take on it. And in democracies where the judicial system is solid and minimally reliable, at least this is what we have in Brazil, right? Abuses to freedom of expression in Brazil, they are to be judged by courts. You know, they are the mandates of not only freedom of expression, but any conflicts involving fundamental rights, right? They're the ones who should decide exactly where this stands. And this is the way I see it. They have an important role in arbitrating in that, but it's not a single role, you know, because courts also they only analyze case by case, and this is something about a broader public sphere of communication. So we do need this this broad and how would I say that in English? This effort that comes from different places. You know, I think we need civil society calling out on courts, calling out on authorities, talking about, you need fact checking, you need people looking at versions of information, but you also need like solid structures that will provide data protection, that will provide internet regulation, and that will provide arbitration of conflicts when this is needed.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Absolutely. I mean, the role of civil society is really huge. And as you correctly said, it's not something that should be dealt with at sort of inside the government alone. And the role of judiciary is very important. But I think we've discussed this before, that judiciary needs to be up to date, you know, with it. Sometimes when it comes to modern day technology, they don't, not obviously, I'm not trying to point fingers, but I'm speaking generally. Sometimes judiciary seems to be out of touch and outdated to the sort of what's going on in this field. So I think legal education is probably of key role as well, and it's important that, you know, through media literacy and correct legal education, we get a generation of lawyers who are well equipped to adjudicate on issues of legal technology. So, Mr. Iglesias Keller, it's been a pleasure talking to you. It's been really important to get an insight on sort of global take on things in this field, because obviously we have a local perspective and then there is a global perspective. And I think social media is one of those areas where you have to be sort of acting in global picture, because it's not authentic. It's not just decided at a sovereign state level. So it was really valuable to get your insight and your take on things, and we are going to sort of we really value your contribution. So thank you very much. And
this has been an absolute pleasure, and I would be happy to continue this conversation later. future. And yes, these are all things that are very dear to me. And I would love to also have an opportunity to learn more about your experience and how Georgia has been dealing with the same sort of challenges.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll have more chance to sort of collaborate and to share experiences. Thank you very, very much, and stay safe during global pandemic.
You too, Nina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just gonna stop recording and just